The Roman Empire, a bulwark of civilization, power, discipline. That's how we're taught it at school, isn't it? We used to admire their roads, their laws, even their water pipes. But what if I told you that behind all this brilliance, there was such an abyss of monstrous, unimaginable cruelty that makes our blood run cold? Behind every stone of the Colosseum, behind every triumphal march, behind every ode of praise, there is an inhuman pain. The pain of those who fell under the steamroller of Roman civilization. Are you really ready to learn what a real hell on earth is, created by the hands of those great Roman soldiers? The very ones whose exploits we are told to study? Today we will bring to light the darkness that has been carefully hidden for centuries. This will not be a story about heroic battles. It will be an immersion in how Rome broke the will and flesh of those who dared to disobey them. We will tell you about 10 Roman tortures that were so cruel and inhumane that they will make you take a fresh look at all this ancient wisdom. It won't be pleasant, but it will be pretty damn instructive. If you are brave enough to find out the truth, watch this video to the end. To begin with, Roman soldiers not only tortured their enemies, but were also prepared to inflict monstrous punishments on their own legions. One of the most terrible and shameful tortures used by Roman commanders was decimation. This is not just a punishment, but a demonstration of absolute ruthless power. If the legion showed cowardice in battle, fled from the battlefield, or committed other collective violations of discipline, it was waiting for a terrible punishment. Every 10th soldier in the legion, which was about 480 people, was chosen by lot and was doomed to death. And it wasn't just an execution. The remaining 90% of the legion, yesterday's comrades in arms, were forced to stone or bludgeon their unfortunate fellow soldiers to death. Imagine this terrible picture. Friends who shared bread and water, fought shoulder to shoulder, now, with eyes full of horror and despair, raised stones at their brothers. This was not an act of revenge, but a cold-blooded, methodical process designed to break the will, destroy the spirit of resistance, and sow fear that will never fade. Decimation as a form of collective punishment has deep roots in Roman military culture. It was first mentioned in the early Republic, although the most well-known cases relate to later periods. Блики, хотя наиболее известные случаи, относятся к более поздним периодам. The Romans believed that discipline was the cornerstone of their military might. Any act of cowardice or rebellion not only undermined morale, but threatened the very existence of the legion and, as a result, the security of the entire empire. Decimation was a response to this threat, an extreme measure designed to restore order at all costs. One of the first documented cases was the decimation performed by Marcus Licinius Crassus in 71 BC during the Spartacus revolt. When some of his troops faltered and fled before the gladiators, Crassus used decimation on the cohorts who showed cowardice. This decision was extremely unpopular among the soldiers, but it instantly restored fear and obedience. Crassus knew that to defeat such a formidable opponent as Spartacus, he needed not just an army, but a soulless, implacable machina, capable of any sacrifice. And decimation was the perfect tool for him. In addition to Crassus, other prominent Roman generals resorted to decimation, although much less often. It was always used as a last resort in exceptional circumstances, when other methods of disciplinary action were ineffective, or when it was necessary to send an extremely strong signal. The very fact of its existence and application served as a powerful deterrent. Imagine not just the horror of death awaiting you, but also the absolute moral corruption that decimation caused. Soldiers who had just fought shoulder to shoulder, shared their meager rations, or perhaps saved each other's lives, were now forced to raise a hand against their brothers. It's not just murder, it's forced fratricide. The drawing of lots to choose their victims added to the irrational, almost mystical horror. No one knew if he would be next. This game with death, where every 10th person was doomed, created an atmosphere of paranoia and distrust. To survive was to become an executioner. How could you look your comrades in the eye after this, knowing that you caused the death of someone who was standing next to you? And how was it possible to fight alongside those who had just killed your friend and live with the knowledge that tomorrow you might find yourself dead, chosen for this monstrous execution? The bodies of slaughtered soldiers were left unburied so that their shame could be seen by all. This was the ultimate humiliation, denying the fallen even the right to a decent burial, which in Roman culture was of great importance. The souls of the unburied, it was believed, could not find rest, doomed to eternal wandering. It wasn't just a physical act of violence, but a curse that would haunt the victim even after death. The survivors were given barley instead of wheat, which was considered the highest degree of shame. Barley, unlike wheat, was considered animal feed and was associated with slaves in the lower strata of society. It was a constant reminder of their cowardice and how unworthy they were to be Roman legionaries. They were living symbols of shame, and this stigma remained with them until the end of their service. Decimation was a rare but extremely effective measure. It did not just punish cowardice, it instilled an absolute horror of disobedience, showing that the life of every soldier is in the hands of the commander and comrades. It was a torture not only of the body, but also of the soul, leaving an indelible mark on the psyche of the survivors. It guaranteed that no legionary would forget that obedience was their primary duty, and the fear of punishment could be far greater than the fear of the enemy. This was not just a punishment, but a demonstration of the unlimited power of the commander and the absolute submission that was required of every soldier. The Roman army was not just a collection of warriors, but a single, ruthless organism, where any deviation from the strictest discipline was punished in the most severe way, even to the point of self-destruction. Was such a price for the order really justified? Crucifixion is perhaps one of the most famous and brutal tortures used by the Romans. This was not just an execution, but a show execution intended for criminals, slaves, and enemies of the state. The purpose of the crucifixion was not to kill quickly, but to demonstrate the absolute power of Rome and cause maximum suffering while the victim slowly died of suffocation, exhaustion, and pain. Imagine a person tied or nailed to a cross. His arms and legs were stretched, his muscles stretched to the limit, and every breath he took was agony. Initially, the victim was nailed to a crossbeam, patibulum, which was then carried to the place of execution, where it was attached to a vertical post. That in itself was part of the humiliation and physical ordeal. Nails, often as thick as a finger, were driven not into the palms of the hands but through the wrists, between the bones to support the weight of the body and prevent tearing of the flesh, and through the heels, nailing the feet to the post. Immediately after the crucifixion, a terrible agony began. The body hanging on the nails was subjected to an unbearable load. The arms and shoulders stretched, the joints shifted. Each breath became unbearable, as the muscles of the diaphragm and chest could not fully work due to the constant tension and weight of the body. The victim struggled to pull herself up, leaning on her punctured legs to ease the pressure on her chest and breathe in air. Each tug brought only a new wave of unbearable pain in his wrists and feet, tearing the fabric around the nails. This cycle of desperate attempts to breathe and piercing pains was repeated again and again, until complete exhaustion. In addition to mechanical suffocation, the crucified victim suffered from many other factors. Excruciating thirst was one of the main tortures. Under the scorching sun, the body quickly became dehydrated, the tongue swelled, the lips cracked, and every breath of air burned the throat. The blood flowing down the body attracted insects, flies, wasps, which landed on open wounds, aggravating the pain. The psychological pressure was no less terrible. The victim hung completely naked or only wearing a loincloth, exposed to the public view and mockery of the crowd. Her last hours were spent in utter humiliation, in full view of everyone. Death occurred from asphyxia, when the victim could no longer pull himself up to breathe and the lungs slowly filled with fluid. The cause of death could also be heart failure, caused by extreme stress and exhaustion, dehydration, shock from blood loss, or a combination of all these factors. Sometimes Roman soldiers mercifully broke victims' shins, crurifragium, to hasten death by suffocation, making it impossible for them to support themselves on their feet and pull themselves up. However, this mercy was the exception rather than the provel. The crucifixion was not just an execution, but a demonstration of intimidation. It was used by the Romans to suppress rebellions, especially slave revolts such as the Spartacus revolt. After the defeat of Spartacus in 71 BC, Crassus crucified more than 6,000 captured slaves along the Appian Way, from Capua to Rome, a distance of about 200 kilometers. It was a living wall of agonized bodies, designed to forever discourage any rebellion. This sight was a lesson to anyone who dared to challenge the might of Rome. The crucifixion was so terrible that even Roman citizens were protected from it by law, as long as they did not commit particularly serious crimes against the state, such as high treason. For citizens, decapitation was usually used, which was considered a more noble death. The crucifix was a symbol of utter humiliation and helplessness, a message to all who dared to challenge Roman authority. It made it clear that Rome would stop at nothing to preserve its empire. What was the psychological impact of this public execution on those who watched it? And how did it affect their submission to Rome if even the toughest of spirits broke down under the spectacle? If you want to find out why the Romans considered crucifixion to be the most effective way to put down revolts, and why even today it remains one of the most horrifying symbols of martyrdom, watch this video to the end. Flagellation, or flagellation, was a common practice in the Roman military and judicial system, but its scale and brutality are often underestimated. It's not just a few lashes. Roman legionaries used special flagrum whips, flagrume, also known as flagellum or horrible flagellum, consisting of several leather belts that were woven with pieces of bone, metal, sharp stones, or small metal balls with spikes. Each blow with the whip didn't just leave a bruise, it tore through skin, tore away flesh, exposed muscle, and even bone. The flagrum has been specially designed to cause maximum pain and injury. The number and shape of the interwoven elements might vary, but the goal was always the same: to tear apart the flesh. The victim was usually tied to a pole or tilted so that his back was as open as possible for blows. Sometimes two executioners would strike at the same time to maximize the effect. The number of blows could reach dozens or even hundreds, depending on the severity of the offense or the purpose of the torture. Imagine the back of a person who receives hundreds of such blows. Each blow from the flagrum didn't just cause pain, it created deep lacerations. Blood flowed in rivulets, mixing with mud and sweat. The flesh on his back, buttocks, and even legs was turning into a bloody mess. Muscles were torn, nerves were damaged. The victim experienced unbearable, searing pain that shot through the entire body, causing involuntary spasms and screams. In addition to the immediate pain, the flagellation caused massive blood loss, which led to shock and rapid loss of consciousness. However, often the executioners brought the victim to his senses to continue the torture. Open wounds were an ideal environment for the development of infections, which in the absence of antibiotics often led to sepsis and death even after the flagellation was completed. Survivors of such flagellation were often left permanently disabled, with disfigured backs, deep scars, and damaged nerves and muscles that made them incapable of hard work or military service. Many died from subsequent complications. Flagellation was intended not only for punishment, but also for obtaining confessions, especially from slaves and non-citizens, as well as for moral and physical suppression. It was widely used in the Roman army to maintain discipline for crimes ranging from desertion and theft to disobeying orders. For citizens, as already mentioned, flagellation was rare and used only in exceptional cases, as it was considered shameful. For example, in judicial practice, flagellation often preceded more severe executions, such as crucifixion, in order to weaken the victim and increase the public effect. The New Testament describes the flagellation of Jesus Christ by Roman soldiers before his crucifixion, which gives an idea of the brutality of this procedure. The brutality of the flagellation was so great that many could not stand it and died right during the torture, even before the blows stopped. This torture was capable of stripping a person of his dignity, turning him into a bloody, trembling mass. It was designed not just to cause pain, but to completely break the will of the victim, to bring it to a state of absolute helplessness and submission. Was this the only way to maintain discipline in 100 huge and powerful armies? Or was it a demonstration of unlimited power that stopped at nothing to ensure absolute obedience? The answer most likely lies in a combination of these factors. The Romans believed that fear was the foundation of porticos, and flagellation was one of the most effective tools for planting it. One of the most terrible and lesser-known tortures that the Romans inflicted on particularly hated enemies, or traitors, was dissection torture, or cutting into pieces. It's not just slashing the body with a sword after death. We are talking about the slow, painful dismemberment of a still living person. Sources indicate that in some cases, the victim's body may have been slowly cut open with saws, swords, or axes, starting from the extremities, prolonging the agony for as long as possible. Imagine this nightmare. A man tied up and immobilized, fully conscious, watching as his body is slowly dissected, part by part. The pain was unbearable, the shock overwhelming. The victim died in terrible agony from blood loss, shock, and unbearable pain. This torture was rare, but it spread quickly, striking terror into the hearts of those who might think of treachery or rebellion against Rome. Sometimes in more merciful cases, the victim's limbs could be chopped off one by one, leaving him to bleed, but saving his life to prolong the torment. This was not just an execution, but a warning carved on the bodies of those who dared to challenge Rome. This torture was the pinnacle of cruelty and was intended to completely break the will of anyone who dared to stand in the way of the empire. Can you call it justice? Or was it a manifestation of the absolute monstrous evil that Rome used to maintain its power? Perhaps one of the reasons why this torture is mentioned less often than crucifixion or burning is because of its extreme degree of abomination and inhumanity, even by the standards of the time. Its use was probably limited to cases where it was necessary not just to kill, but to humiliate as much as possible and cause unbearable suffering, turning death into a frightening public spectacle. The goal was to sow panic fear and suppress even the thought of resistance. The Romans were adept at creating control systems, and terror was one of their most effective tools. The cutting served this purpose perfectly, leaving an indelible mark on the memory of eyewitnesses and spreading stories of incredible suffering. This method didn't just punish the individual, it served as a showpiece of the empire's absolute power and ruthlessness. Evidence of this torture is often found in the context of punishment for high treason or particularly serious crimes against the gods. Roman law, although it had its own principles, often deviated from them when it came to maintaining public order and intimidating potential rebels. Dissection torture wasn't just a physical attack, it was a psychological blow that destroyed a person from the inside out, making it impossible for them to even hope for a quick death. Muscles, nerves, bones, everything was slowly destroyed, and the consciousness remained unclouded so that the victim fully felt the horror of what was happening. The use of this method also highlights the sophistication of the Roman understanding of pain and its use as a control tool. This was not just a murder, but a ritualized destruction of the body, designed to be an unforgettable lesson for anyone who dared to defy the will of Rome. Rumors of such torture spread from mouth to mouth, creating an atmosphere of pervasive fear that could overwhelm the most daring thoughts of resistance. In the end, dissection torture was not just an execution, but an act of barbaric show of force designed to impress the inevitability and brutality of imperial justice on people's minds forever. Burial alive was another form of execution and torture that the Romans used on certain categories of criminals, most often Vestal virgins who broke their vows of chastity, or those who committed particularly serious crimes against the gods or the state. This torture was particularly terrible for its slowness and the absolute helplessness of the victim. Imagine, a person is placed in a deep pit, which is then slowly covered with earth. First, sand or earth covers the legs, then the body, gradually reaching the head. The victim is fully conscious, feeling the pressure build up. Her lungs constrict, and the air becomes heavier. This is not just physical torture, but also a terrible psychological agony. The realization that you are slowly dying of suffocation, buried alive, without the slightest opportunity to resist. Fear, claustrophobia, and the horror of being helpless. All of this came crashing down on the victim as her body slowly sank into eternal darkness. Death was due to suffocation, shock, or a heart attack. This torture was particularly symbolic, as the land was considered sacred, and being buried alive was an act of double humiliation, both before men and before the gods. What message did Rome send by using such sophisticated and brutal forms of execution? And how did it affect the minds of citizens living under its rule? For Vestal virgins, breaking the vow of chastity was considered a crime against the whole of Rome, as their purity was inextricably linked to the well-being of the city. Being buried alive was not only a punishment, but also an attempt to purge the desecrated land of the presence of a sinner. This method of execution was subtly cruel in its simplicity. It didn't require complicated tools, but it caused maximum suffering, playing on the primal human fears of confined spaces, darkness, and slow suffocation. The inability to resist, the lack of air, the slow realization of the inevitable end. All this made burying alive one of the most painful and humiliating executions. This method also demonstrated absolute control, Rome's absolute control not only over life and death, but also over the earth itself, which received and absorbed its unworthy children. Burning alive was another horrific form of execution and torture that the Romans used on those deemed particularly dangerous or blasphemous, such as early Christians who refused to worship Roman gods. This torture was one of the most excruciating, as the fire caused unbearable pain, burning the flesh layer by layer. Imagine a person tied to a pole or placed in a cage surrounded by burning wood. First, the smoke and heat burn the lungs, then the fire slowly begins to consume the skin and flesh. The pain was so intense that the victim often screamed, struggled in agony, trying to escape from the fiery trap. The sight was terrifying, and the smell of burning flesh filled the air. Death occurred from shock, asphyxia due to smoke inhalation, or from extensive burns. Often this execution was carried out in public to instill fear in the crowd and demonstrate the consequences of disobedience. For the Romans, this was not only a punishment, but also a way of cleansing from heresy or crime. Was this torture simply an act of desperation on the part of the Romans? Or was it a planned scare tactic designed to crush any resistance? If you want to find out why even in such conditions, some people did not renounce their beliefs, watch this video to the end. Burning alive had a deep symbolic meaning in Roman society, where fire was often associated with purification and divine judgment. For those who were sentenced to this terrible fate, it was not just a physical end, but also a public branding as enemies of the state and the gods. Fire slowly destroyed the body, but as the Romans believed, it also burned sins and cleansed the earth from defilement. In the case of Christians, their refusal to worship the Roman gods and the emperor was seen as an act of rebellion and blasphemy. Burning was chosen as a way of demonstrative punishment to turn others away from the new faith. Christian martyrs who met their deaths in the fire with incredible calmness and faith became inspirations for their followers, which only further infuriated the Roman authorities, who did not understand the nature of their beliefs. The intensity of pain when burned alive is second to none, as the fire irreversibly destroys nerve endings, muscles, and bones. This sight, with its sounds and smells, was intended to inspire horror and disgust, discourage any desire for disobedience, and establish the absolute power of Rome. Paradoxically, it was these brutal executions that often strengthened the faith of those who were subjected to them and inspired others to join a movement that was willing to make such sacrifices for themselves and their beliefs. Throwing at wild animals, or damnatio ad bestias, was a popular but incredibly brutal form of execution and entertainment in the Roman Empire, especially in amphitheaters such as the Colosseum. This torture was intended for the lowest strata of society, slaves, criminals, and later Christians. The victims, unarmed and defenseless, rushed to the arena, where hungry lions, tigers, bears, or other predators were waiting for them. Imagine an arena drenched in blood, where a man tries to escape from a snarling beast, or fights with his bare hands against a predator that is many times stronger than him. The audience cheered as they watched this terrible spectacle, where a human life was worthless. Death was quick and painful, torn apart, strangled, torn to pieces. This torture was not just a way to kill a man, but a way to humiliate him, to deprive him of all dignity, to turn his death into a spectacle for the crowd. It served as a powerful propaganda tool, demonstrating the superiority of Roman power over human life and nature. Was this brutality part of Roman culture, or was it a manifestation of fear and a desire for absolute control over the masses? Damnatio ad bestias was the pinnacle of the Roman spectacle, where the boundaries between punishment and entertainment were completely blurred. The public slaughter of people in the arena was not just an execution, it was a symbol of Roman power and ruthlessness, able to maintain fear and order among the population. For the Romans, this was not only a show of force, but also a religious act, a kind of sacrifice to the gods who demanded blood and violence. Victims, especially Christians, often refused to renounce their faith, which from the point of view of the Romans, made them even more worthy of such a terrible fate. They died with a prayer in their mouths, which only served to increase the fury of the crowd, who did not understand their resilience. This type of execution also served a social function, allowing the masses to vent aggression and tension, distracting from everyday problems and potential dissatisfaction with the authorities. The Roman nobility and emperors actively used these spectacles to maintain their popularity and legitimacy. The more spectacular and brutal the execution, the more applause it generated. It was a perverse art of death, where the human body became a canvas to express the absolute power of Rome. In addition to demonstrating power, damnatio ad bestias also served practical purposes. It made it possible to get rid of a large number of criminals and enemies of the state without having to keep them in prisons, which would be expensive and inefficient. In addition, it was a way to test and temper gladiators if they were released into the arena along with the beasts, as well as train new animals for future spectacles. Beasts, especially those that were hungry and specially prepared for the arena, were not just animals. They became living instruments of execution, capable of instilling primal terror into anyone who looked at them. The very process of preparing animals for such spectacles, their training and maintenance, was a separate, often brutal industry that worked to ensure a constant flow of actors for blood games. Sources describe that sometimes the victims were given wooden swords or shields to create the illusion of fighting, but this only prolonged the agony and made the spectacle even more disgusting and humiliating. People who were thrown at the beasts lost not only their lives but also their human form, turning into prey whose death was just part of the bloody show. Some historians argue that damnatio ad bestias was one of the most dehumanizing forms of execution, as it reduced a person to the level of an animal who did not have the right to a dignified death. This method of execution also highlights the gap between the upper and lower strata of Roman society. For the nobles, it was a diversion. For the slaves and criminals, it was an inevitable end. And for the Christians, it was a test of faith, which they often passed with amazing fortitude, which only caused the Romans to be even more perplexed. Beheading or beheading, although a relatively quick method of execution compared to other tortures, was still considered shameful and was used for war criminals, deserters, or rioters. In the Roman context, although it was not torture in the sense of causing prolonged suffering, the act of taking one's head was humiliating and final. Imagine an executioner raising a sword or axe over the neck of a man who is waiting for his imminent death. One blow, and life ends. The head is separated from the body. This method of execution was used to maintain strict discipline in the legions and to intimidate the population. Although the physical suffering was short-lived, the psychological impact on those who watched the execution was enormous. The bodies of decapitated criminals were often displayed for all to see, and their heads could be impaled on stakes to serve as a warning. This was a public humiliation, which deprived a person of the right to a decent burial and symbolized his complete exclusion from society. Why did the Romans, having such efficient and rapid methods of execution, continue to use more sophisticated tortures on their enemies? And what did this say about their attitude to human life? The beheading, despite its speed, carried a deep symbolic meaning. In Roman society, the head was considered the center of personality, honor, and identity. Separating the head from the body was not only an act of physical destruction, but also of complete spiritual and social humiliation. For the Romans, who valued civil rights and dignity, such an execution was particularly shameful, since it took away the possibility of a person being buried with honors, which was of great importance for the afterlife according to their beliefs. This method of execution also served as a powerful visual warning to those who might be contemplating disobedience. The exposed heads on stakes were mute witnesses to Rome's harsh justice, reminding everyone of the consequences of breaking the law. It was gestoque napomenanium, a cruel reminder that even after death, the enemy of the empire would not find peace, and his memory would be desecrated. In addition to its purely symbolic meaning, beheading was a practical method for executing sentences on a large scale, especially when it came to mass executions following uprisings or military campaigns. Its relatively high speed allowed it to execute many people in a short time, which was important for maintaining order and discipline in large armies and provinces. This method required less resources compared to crucifixion or throwing at beasts, which also made it cost-effective in a large empire setting. Although physical suffering was minimal compared to other tortures, the psychological effect on witnesses was maximal. The spectacle of beheading, even if it lasted only a few seconds, left an indelible mark on the memory and served as a powerful tool of intimidation. Unlike other forms of execution, beheading was often the prerogative of Roman citizens, who were thus mercifully spared prolonged torment. However, this did not detract from the shame and humiliation associated with this act. It was a way to show that even a citizen who committed a crime against the state can be deprived of his life, and his death will serve as an example for everyone else. Thus, the Romans skillfully combined practicality and symbolism in their methods of execution, creating a complex system of punishments designed to maintain their power and order. Torture by hunger and thirst was one of the most insidious methods used by the Romans. It required no instruments of torture, only time and absolute isolation. The victim was kept in dank, dark dungeons, without food or water, slowly watching her body and mind fade away. Imagine this agony: an unbearable thirst, a parched throat, a splitting head. Then the hunger began, a constant, obsessive, stomach-churning hunger. The body weakened, the muscles atrophied, the brain became blurred. Hallucinations, delusions, apathy, all this accompanied a slow death from exhaustion. This torture was especially effective for obtaining information, since under its pressure, a person was ready to do anything to get even a drop of water or a crumb of bread. It was also used to kill enemies who did not want to be executed in public, and even those whose death they wanted to prolong as long as possible. It was slow, relentless, and left the victim completely helpless. How long could a person survive such an ordeal, and what was left of their personality after they went through this hell? Torture by hunger and thirst is the quintessence of psychological and physiological sadism. It deprived the victim of basic human needs, turning his existence into a continuous agony. The absence of external injuries made this torture clean in the eyes of the executioners, but no less destructive for the victim. The gradual depletion of the body led to catastrophic changes in all systems. The brain, deprived of nutrients and water, began to function with disorders, causing psychotic episodes and loss of sanity. This torture was particularly effective for breaking the will, since the victim was completely dependent on their tormentors. Every day was a struggle for survival, a struggle with my own body, which was slowly but surely failing. The Romans understood that the greatest suffering did not come from wounds, but from the lack of vital elements. This torture was an example of invisible cruelty, which left behind not a mutilated body, but a destroyed soul. One of the lesser-known but equally disgusting tortures that the Romans might have used was that of rats. Although there are not many direct and detailed descriptions of this torture in classical Roman texts, such methods were known in the ancient world and could well be used in various variations. The essence of the torture was to exploit the rats' natural desire for food and light, turning them into a tool of torture. Imagine the victim tied up and immobilized, with his stomach or chest exposed. A bowl or bucket of hungry rats was placed on the body, and a hot metal object or hot coal was placed on top of it. The rats, trying to escape the heat and find a way out, began to chew their way through the victim's flesh. It was a torture that caused unbearable pain, shock, and absolute terror. Rats chewed through skin, muscles, and internal organs, leaving behind horrific wounds and leading to a slow, painful death from blood loss, infection, or shock. The psychological aspect of this torture was no less terrifying than the physical one. The realization that living things were eating you alive was enough to break anyone. This torture was the height of sadism, demonstrating the boundless cruelty of those who used it. Rat torture is an example of sophisticated psychological pressure combined with physical suffering. Although its widespread use in Rome is not documented in as much detail as other methods, the very existence of such torture in human history underscores the limits of human cruelty. Rats, usually associated with dirt and disease, became the tools of an absolute nightmare. Their small, rapid movements, squeaks, and crawling sensations created unbearable psychological pressure even before the physical torment began. The horror of waiting for the rodents to start biting into the flesh was probably even worse than the pain itself. Directing the rats to the soft tissues of the body, the abdomen, chest was designed to cause maximum damage to internal organs and create a prolonged, agonizing death. This torture, if it was used, was most likely in dungeons and secret prisons, where it was necessary to get information or get rid of unwanted people without too much noise and publicity. It is one of the most disgusting examples of the use of animals as a tool of torture, demonstrating how far people could go in their desire to cause pain. The types of torture and execution we have examined in ancient Rome, from dissection torture to being thrown at animals and slowly dying from hunger and thirst, paint a picture of a society where power and control were maintained not only by laws in the army, but also by total fear. These methods were not random acts of violence. They were carefully designed tools designed to crush any resistance, strengthen discipline, and demonstrate the absolute power of the empire. Regardless of whether it was public spectacles in the Colosseum or secret torments in the dark dungeons, each torture carried a deep psychological message. It was supposed to break not only the body, but also the spirit of the victim, turning it into a weak-willed creature or a terrifying example for others. The Romans understood that the most effective control was mind control, and harsh punishments were one of the ways to achieve this goal. However, as history has shown, even in the face of such unthinkable cruelty, the human spirit sometimes found the strength to resist. Martyrs who refused to renounce their beliefs became symbols of perseverance and faith, refuting the executioner's plan. It makes us think about the complex nature of power, fear, and human resilience in the face of absolute violence. Ultimately, these tales of Roman torture not only remind us of the dark pages of history, but also serve as a warning of what humanity can do when it loses sight of the value of human life.